She's worked here for many years, but she's done many other things. So let me introduce you to her. Born in Manchester, Sue studied sculpture at Sheffield University and then went off to the Royal College in the early 90s. So recent shows are Hidden Histories, Untold Stories at Warrington Museum and Art Gallery, Trade Winds at St. Peter's Church in Cambridge. Sue's also exhibited internationally as well as extensively in the UK, and she's in quite a few collections, aren't you? Lots of residencies and commissions, including the Royal Shakespeare Company, the residency
Royal
there?
Shakespeare Company,
Yeah?
in Stratford.
And also, there's another one that was on the tip of my tongue, but it's gone. The V&A. Did one at the V&A as well, didn't you? Okay, so short little bio blurb. So Susan Stockwell is an established international artist working across sculpture, installation, and film. Her practice is concerned with examining social and colonial stories and engaging with questions of social justice, feminism, and materiality. Susan's art employs the material culture of everyday objects and manufacturing products such as toilet paper, recycled computer components, maps, and money, and she transforms these banal products into compelling artworks. So, Sue, take it away.
Thanks, Amanda. Can you all hear me? Okay, good. Well, it's very nice to be here today. Thanks for inviting me in. I used to teach here, so it's great to actually come back and see some fresh faces and some familiar faces. I will talk about my work for about 45 minutes and show images. And I'll give you a sort of plotted history a bit from when I was a student to how I got to where I am today. You can, if there's something that's really not clear, please ask a question. But we'll have a Q&A at the end of about 15 or 20 minutes, so there'll be opportunities to discuss things and ask more questions then. Okay, so I'm introducing myself with this image because I met these artists called the Guerrilla Girls. I'm sure you've heard of them. When I was at Frieze a few years ago, and they've always been heroines of mine. And I was delighted to meet them and actually have a picture taken of them. You can see the guy in the background was actually following them because they thought they might cause trouble because they were trying to film and they weren't allowed to. They were secretly filming. Anyway, they're all female and based in New York. I asked if I could join them, but they said no, because you have to live in New York to become a guerrilla girl. And they told me to set up a similar guerrilla organization in London, which sadly I've not got around to. This is a piece of their work from a long time ago that I've always kept on my studio wall just to remind me of how far I either have or haven't come in the art world. Another kind of thing to introduce myself is I grew up in what I call a make, do and mend household in Manchester with socialist parents, and my mother would recycle absolutely everything. This is her sewing box made up of recycled pill tins and tobacco tins and that kind of thing. And we used to have a joke that that there was a world shortage of yogurt cartons because they were all in her kitchen cupboard. I'm not a very good recycler now, but I think that influenced my work. So, you know, all those kind of forces of growing up in this quite political, socialist, make, do and mend household in Manchester, in the north of England, really have formed me into the artist that I am today. My father was also a historian, trained as a historian, so I think that had a big influence on me, and if I hadn't been an artist, I probably would have been a historian. So I'm very interested in social history, really, and that's where quite a lot of the ideas for my work stem from. So I remember seeing this years ago, this map of the British Empire marked in red, which is quite shocking that it was so massive at one time, not only 100 years ago, in fact. And then this is a more contemporary version. This is a Facebook map of the world. So I thought it was quite an interesting contrast. And also I've traveled a lot over the years. I've traveled a lot just out of interest for this kind of desire to get out of Manchester originally, I suppose, but also to see these phenomenal landscapes, particularly in the southwest of the United States of America. And these canyons like the Grand Canyon, these kind of really phenomenal things that influenced me in the sense of the scale and the materiality of my work, which you'll see coming later. When I was at college, I went and did my BA in Sheffield in the 1980s, and in sculpture, and it was quite a radical course. We were almost locked in the studio for 3-week projects, and we had to work with a material. So it was very sort of essential and material based. So for the first 3 weeks, we were given a pile of sawdust and told to work with it for 3 weeks. And we couldn't use glues or water or forming materials. So we buried each other in it, and we blew it with hoovers, and we drew with it, and we did what we could with it. And then I made this mold and packed it into the mold, which was a copy of the steps out of the studio. And then I stood on it. This was a performance. You can see it was in the 1980s from my clothes and my haircut. So anyway, but it was a very it wasn't particularly interesting in a way in itself, but it was a formative project for me because it pushed me to work with one material in a very creative way and to really push its boundaries, to explore it, which is one of the things that I've done ever since. So I'm really interested in material and materiality, material history, material culture. And after I left college, I had a studio in Sheffield for 3 years, which was great because it was like £17 a month. It was incredibly cheap. And I used to get my artist grant some of the time, which was basically signing on the dole, which you could do in those days, and make art for a lot of the time. And I was working with I didn't have much money, but I was working with lots of materials. And one day I went to a garage and had the tires on my car changed. And there was this massive pile of rubber inner tubes from cars when we used to have inner tubes inside tires and tires as well. And the guy, I said, "Oh, that looks really interesting. Can I take some?" And he said, "Yeah, take them all because there's a real problem getting rid of them. I have to pay a lot of money to get them burnt or buried. And most of the landfill sites in the north of England are full. So if you can do something with them, I can give you an endless supply for free." So I took the tires and the inner tubes, but I didn't use the tires. But I started to work with the inner tubes, and I was also reading about the history of rubber and the history, where it came from. Originally, it grew in the Brazilian rainforest, wild. And I was also reading about Brazil and what was happening in Brazil with deforestation. And I read a book about this guy called Chico Mendes, who was the first Brazilian eco-warrior, who became known in the early 80s. He realized he grew up in a village in the deep rainforest near Bolivia, and he was the head of the Rubber Tappers Union. He was very political, and he realized that there was a massive deforestation problem in the Brazilian rainforest. So he taught himself to read when he was 19 and traveled the world and went to all the major governments and told them about the problem with the Brazilian rainforest and logging and deforestation. And he actually became very well known and liked. And he put the issue of the Brazilian rainforest on the map really for the first time. And America actually made some major legislation then to help to stop logging. Unfortunately, for a few years, and then they've gone backwards ever since. But I started to explore this material, I started to read about it, and I made my first map with rubber, you can see on the right there, which is of Brazil. And I also started to illustrate these points that I was reading about, all this information. I started to make these quite illustrative maps about the rainforest and deforestation and the history of Brazil and so on. But what I realized, it was a very important lesson at this stage in my development, was that when I worked in that kind of illustrative way, trying to make a political point or trying to say something, quite obviously it really didn't work for me. It became one-dimensional and illustrative, literally, and not very interesting. Whereas when I worked more intuitively with the material, kind of seeing what I could do with it, seeing what limits I could push it to. So these pots, for example, are inner tubes that are cut on the inside and rolled up and form these big pots. And I use the valves and things. And then I cut the inner tubes up and made these huge spheres out of them. I had a show about a year from finding the inner tubes in a big gallery in Sheffield called the Mappin, and I had 2 massive rooms. It was quite a luxury to have. But there was a strong artist group in Sheffield, and we all worked together and got these venues and got money from the Henry Moore Foundation in Leeds to pay for it. And we all had shows in these great big spaces. So it was quite a challenge, though, because when you're just out of college, to make a big show in a big space can be quite demanding. But I decided to make the whole show with rubber inner tubes and really explore the material. I also did these drawings, which you can see a bit of, with a caldo and oil and wax. And I was looking at the material. I was also looking at mythology, female mythology, rubber, the history of rubber, other materials that evolved with rubber. And I realized that rubber, so this is room 1 full of sculptures, and this is room 2 full of this enormous installation, which the piece at the end is about 15 foot high. And they were all inner tubes that were cut on the outside and stitched together and hung or woven together. And I used car tubes and truck tubes and lots of different scale and sizes. And it was very kind of dark and dense, this space. And I had been trying to kind of talk in the work very obviously about the rainforest and deforestation, but it didn't work so well. But it was great because when I actually made this big installation, and we did lots of workshops with kids, they sort of all said, oh, it reminds us of the Brazilian rainforest, which we're learning about at school. So I gave them all A's. But, it was quite interesting having that dialogue going on and the work not being kind of obviously about something. But it seemed to work through a kind of process of osmosis, which is something that I learned very clearly at that stage and kind of really used a lot in my work over the years. And also I just enjoy, apart from enjoying the researching and the reading about a material and its history, I also enjoy working with materials. I enjoy making things. I enjoy manipulating materials and transforming them. The rubber was really interesting because it's got a lot of petroleum byproducts in it, and it starts to look on a mass like a petroleum byproduct. And it's got all sorts of kind of marks and rust and things in it. But what happened after working with it for a couple of years is that everything I own smelt of rubber. It's incredibly toxic. And so after a while, it completely put me off any rubber products. Although I realized that rubber, another point in this whole process was to realize that a material like rubber is incredibly important to industrialization. So without rubber, we couldn't use electricity. We couldn't land a plane. A plane is we use to keep us dry. We use it for so many different things in our industrialized world, developed world. But we don't really think about it. We don't really think about where it's from or how we transform it or what other products we put into it or how it's processed or what happens to it when we throw it away. And we throw a lot of it away. And it has been an incredibly toxic material as well, along with lots of other materials which I'll go on to talk about. So anyway, while I was doing this, I made the work and then moved on. But then I managed to get a grant to go on a pilgrimage to the home of Chico Mendes. Chico Mendes became really well known for being an eco-warrior, for putting the Brazilian rainforest issue on the map. And because the local logging families were not happy, they assassinated him. And what happened, that was I think in 1984 or 5, he was assassinated. But what that did is it actually put him on the international map. So all the newspapers from all over the world who already knew about him and had been writing about him, learned he'd been assassinated. So overnight he became a hero and incredibly famous. And all the big newspapers went to his village, which is in the deep rainforest. So it really did put that issue on the map, actually. Strangely, his death put the issue of the rainforest on the map. So I managed to get a grant to get to his village and see where he came from. And they've made a museum of his house, which is here. And also there's a rubber museum there. And I went into the rainforest and looked at how rubber trees are tapped. The only reason why rubber, because they grow wild in the rainforest, they grow about 1 kilometre apart, and it's very difficult to produce masses of rubber from them. So rubber only became a big mass-produced product when they could propagate it. So a British man took rubber from the rainforest and propagated it in Kew, and then it was grown in mass in plantations, and it was only once it was industrialized that we had rubber, and that was actually en masse, and that was one of the contributing factors to the Industrial Revolution happening when it did, because without rubber we couldn't actually have really had an Industrial Revolution. So I went and looked at, how rubber's tapped from the tree. They call it the Weeping Wood, and this is Chico Mendes' village, and this is deforestation. So we went to this very remote place on a real pilgrimage, a long way from anywhere, a long way from Manaus, which is halfway up the Amazon in Brazil. It took a long time to get there. And then we drove for a few hundred miles on these roads, on just these very thin tarmac roads. And for about 5 kilometers on either side of the road are these burnt rainforests, and every year they burn them back. And it's very apocalyptic, very strange, and very kind of eerie. And they grow cattle on these burnt areas. So there's like, many millions of kilometers that are burnt back every year for cattle to be raised for meat for us to eat. So it was really a profound trip. Anyway, moving on. I then went to the Royal College of Art. I got into the Royal College of Art in London and decided to leave Sheffield, move to London and do an MA in sculpture at the Royal College. And over time, I started to work with different materials, and I was making paper mache forms. And I was looking for the best paper to make paper mache with. And they were very fragile organic forms. I was trying to get this kind of real sense of fragility, kind of on the edge, something almost about to disappear. My father died when I was 18 of a very horrible cancer, and I watched him die. And I think from that really affected my work and influenced me, and I had this sense of wanting to put a sense of disappearance or something on the edge of disappearance into the work. So I was making these really fragile forms, and somebody said, oh, what you need is paper mache. To make good paper mache is toilet paper. So I rang up Kimberly-Clark or Kleenex and explained what I was doing as a student at the Royal College of Art. Could they sponsor me by providing me with material, as in, I thought I'd get 2 boxes of toilet paper or something. Anyway, the next week, this massive articulated truck arrived at the Royal College with about 2,000 5-foot length rolls of toilet paper, about this long. They call them logs, ironically, before they get cut into rolls. And my whole studio was literally walled with these. It's like the walls were covered in these 5-foot lengths of toilet paper. So I was using it to make paper mache with, which was great, but I thought, hang on a minute, this material has got its own inherent content and meanings and histories. And so I started to read about it and research it, and I went to the Kleenex factory and got a guided tour and learned how toilet paper, it uses lots of processes, but it's essentially wood pulp that gets sent through an air dryer. It doesn't have any fiber in it, it just has a bit of acid in it so it doesn't go yellow. So it's really wood pulp, that's all it is, but it's blown into these really thin sheets that are designed to biodegrade very quickly. It still takes 2 to 3 years to biodegrade in sewers, which is much, much better than papers that we use, some of which don't biodegrade at all. So, it is an interesting product. In America, it was voted, this is a show in America. I actually started to work with the paper and transform it into these forms. I did lots of things with it. I jumped through it, I shot it, I cut through it, I dipped it in paint. I did lots of things with it. But in the end, I started to pile it up into these massive forms. Because I had so much of it, I could really experiment and play with it and really push it, the material to its boundaries. So I started to make these massive piled up forms. Some, like this piece called Cascade, which is in a museum in America that is massive. It has a Philip Johnson Museum. It has a 27-foot high ceiling, so that's a huge piece. And then there are these sort of columns around it, which were made in molds. And there's no forming material. Going back to the sawdust, there's no forming materials in these. They're just paper that is literally embedded in molds, and it goes back into wood pulp, and it actually holds its form and shape very, very well for a long time. It's very tough once you take the molds away. As you can see, this piece is made in Britain. This is like old world toilet paper that's got all these different colours in it. So although it's white, the material varies enormously depending on whether it's been recycled, what toilet paper's been blown on the machine before, where the wood pulp comes from, and so on. So it's very strata-like, and these blocks, these columns started to resemble travertine marble, which is quite interesting. And this was in Battersea Art Centre, which was originally a town hall, apparently, and it's made with a sense of permanence and authority. And it's kind of ironic that I was making these massive forms that look like travertine marble, but were actually made out of the most impermanent of that shouldn't really last, although they did last quite a long time. And it was the blocks were very much affected by the architecture of this building and the marble and the stone and the spaces. This actually was a later piece that I got invited to make a version of in America in this museum. And I got the toilet paper in America, so Kleenex in America sponsored me. There's a factory just down the road from this. And it was really interesting because when I got there in America, the paper was much longer, the logs were much longer, and they were all a kind of cream, and they had a scent, so that it was like New World toilet paper as opposed to Old World toilet paper. Apparently that year in America it had been voted the most popular product. But it's kind of strange that it doesn't, it's something we don't really need, but we burn through millions and millions and millions of acres of forest to they say it's sustainable, but I don't think it is really. So it's a very polluting, very consuming material. And it does biodegrade eventually, but not that easily, in fact. So it's another kind of interesting material of our cultures, our contemporary world. This is me making the box. They're quite physical. It's quite physical work, just my body weight and a stick I use to pound them. And then they eventually become these very solid forms when I get enough paper in them. About this time, I was invited to be in a show in New England, in America, in Connecticut. And so the museum had been a house, so I made these quilts that were made from tea bags, cupcake holders, that you make fairy cakes in, and cushion cup holders, which you get in America that I stain with coffee. So there were these very sort of fragile paper quilts, but this was a traditional quilt making area of America, famous for that, and this had been a bedroom in the house, so it seemed to sort of fit. And I made these with a sense of, using everyday domestic materials that, again, we take for granted and don't really think about, but that are actually very beautiful and have really fascinating histories. I mean, tea and coffee are amazing products, and I'd been living in America for a little while before this, and everybody drank coffee, which I started to read about, and apparently the main ingredient of rat poison is caffeine. So that's why it makes you hyper, because it stimulates your liver to produce adrenalines. So it wakes you up, but it's actually really toxic if you drink enough of it. Whereas tea is also toxic, but tea has this fascinating history that there is a claim that the Opium Wars between the British Empire and China created all the money, which was really exploitative. I mean, half of China was addicted to opium at one point. But the British Empire made enormous amounts of money out of it. And that actually paid for the Industrial Revolution to happen when it did. So all these materials, I'm really interested in the history of the material and how it contributes to where we are today and our histories and our culture. So, the humble material of tea, the humble domestic kind of product, it's quite amazing, has all these claims attached to it. I'm not quite sure how true that is, but people have written theses about it. So this is a cupcake holder quilt. And then the space opposite, I had this work in the show, and the space opposite, the artist pulled out at the last minute. So they asked if I could make a piece quickly for the space. So I said, well, if the Kleenex will give me some paper, then yes. I rang up Kleenex and said, can you give me 20 logs of paper? And so they delivered them the next day. And we took them out to this. One of the artists had a big backyard, and he also had a cupboard full of guns. I tried to shoot the paper when I'd been in England, but it's very difficult because it doesn't really work with a deer slug pellet, and you have to get the police or the army involved to use a gun here. But in America, everybody has guns, really easy to access. So we got this deer rifle and deer slugs and shot through 20 sheets of paper in his yard. And then I lined them all up in the gallery. We shot 15 holes. You can't really see them there, but there are 15 holes in this. So these deer slug pellets go right through, and they're kind of like light tunnels. So you look through all different heights so different people can see through. You look through, and it was in front of a window. So you get this light coming through. So it's like a snow tunnel or a light tunnel. So everybody came into this space and didn't really think this was anything, and then looked into these holes and saw these kind of light tunnels going through to the green of the garden behind. So it's very hard to photograph. It's quite an effective piece, but it's also a time-based piece because as you look down the side, the paper ripped. So even though this is just very fragile paper, and this is a massive deer slug pellet that could kill 2 human beings, The paper had a lot of resistance, so you had this kind of line of the hole opening. Anyway, that was an interesting project for me, and that was, over a period of quite a few years working with toilet paper. This is now we've jumped forward into the 2000s, and I got invited to do a residency in China. So I went to work in a place called Nanjing in an art centre, Shanghua Art Centre, with another British artist, and the brief was that we made installation art, and the art centre wanted a bit more installation art because they were mainly painters. It was all Chinese artists, they were mainly painters. So we went there for about 6 weeks, and again, I just looked at the things around me. I looked at the everyday materials, the things I saw on the street, which were quite amazing at the time. China was massively changing at that time. In 2005, this was. So this is a bottle recycler. So these are all bottles that somebody gathers and collects and takes to the local recycling centre and sells them on, makes a living out of it, and then the local recycling centre sells them on to a bigger recycling centre, and so on and so forth. And that was the same with many things that I saw. This is just a road sweeper that I really liked. So I put it in, it just went round and round. It just sort of swept the dirt, but it was just sort of fascinating. Oh, and this is the slowest taxi, I think, in the world. This is an ox pulling a Eastern European truck that's the taxi cab. So I was just sort of surrounded by this visual onslaught when I was there, and I decided I was only there for 6 weeks, so it was quite an intense project. I decided to make my own recycle piece. So I went to the local recycling centre and bought 2 tons of cardboard boxes, or was it 3 tons? I can't remember. 2 or 3 tons of cardboard boxes, and they delivered them. And then over the course of about a month, I made this stack of cardboard. And a lot of the boxes had a lot of colour, red and green, and text in them, what we call jingling. And so I particularly found those bits and stacked them up. And you can see lots of sort of text. It doesn't necessarily make any sense, but it's quite interesting when you see it all together en masse. And then this was the finished object. So it's about 3.5 metre high stack. There were other pieces I made as well, but it was a very cold space and it was winter time. So I had to work physically. And I had help as well, which is great, which is not necessarily the case at the time. So I made use of it and made this sort of piece that was an installation, but it was also a bit like a painting that had so much colour and texture in it. And I also made this piece. I made a few other map pieces, and this was made out of Chinese calligraphy paper that people learn to write on. And it's a sort of shape of China, and they're just sort of piled up. So it looks like phyllo pastry or something. They're very kind of edible, physical pieces, sensual pieces. And it was quite interesting because it took me to Taiwan, this piece of work. On the day of the opening, the art centre rang me up and said, "Oh, you'll have to come down. We have a problem with your map of China because it doesn't have Taiwan in it." And I was kind of like, "What do you mean it doesn't have Taiwan in it? It's not a map of China." Anyway, we had this big conversation. They wanted to take it out of the show because they were worried that if the authorities came, they would withdraw their money because it didn't have a map. It was a map of China. It didn't have Taiwan in it because there was a massive, and still is today very much at the moment, contention between mainland China and Taiwan. Mainland China see Taiwan as part of China, and Taiwan and the Western world, America, sees it as a separate country. And there's a big, interesting history. So I persuaded them to leave it in the show because it's not really a map, it's an artwork and so on. And there were no other islands in it either, so it stayed in. But then I saw, after I left China and I was back in England, I saw this application for a residency in Taiwan. So I told the story in the application and got the residency, so it took me to Taiwan. I read about the whole history of Taiwan and China, and absolutely fascinating. So I got to go to Taiwan, and I really like it when your work takes you to a place that you never would have gone to before. I didn't know about Taiwan and China. So here I am in Taiwan a year later. And I stayed at this place called Taipei Artists Village, which doesn't look like a village, but it is. So it was amazing because I got a studio and a place to live for 3 months and a stipend from the British Council. And also some support to make a project about the subway or the underground systems and Asian urbanism, which is a concept of urbanism that grows very quickly without planning, very different to here. And it was great because there were artists, dancers, writers, curators from all over the world, musicians from all over the world coming to this place for anything from 3 weeks to 6 months to work effectively. So there's lots of cross-fertilization of ideas and ways of working, processes and methodologies. And there were some workshops and an exhibition space. So it was a great time, and it really helped me. When I was actually there, I was doing a lot of sewing. I was stitching maps. This is a map of the London subway, obviously, that I stitched because I was homesick. But I was working in that way, and I was drawing and painting with tea, with Ula. Oh, this is a bit poignant for me because I lost my dog recently. But this is Toto, who was a street dog in Taiwan who used to come to my studio and help me. And I brought him back to England with me. It's like the ultimate souvenir of an artist residency. But he was a street dog. He would have probably been run over eventually, but he was wonderful. So that was 15 years ago. So we just recently lost him. Artist residencies, which are varied and many, can take you to very interesting places and can do lots of different things for your practice and so worth thinking about. What I really wanted to do when I was in Taiwan that first time was to work with computer components, because Taiwan is the home of the electronics industry and computers. They were all made there at one time. They're now not. They're made in mainland China mainly, but originally that's where they came from. But I couldn't source the components. So I got invited a bit later to go back and do a show at the Hong Foundation for Education and Culture in Taipei City. And it so happened that the guy who owned it, who ran it, was Royce Hong, was Mr. Panasonic, Taiwan. So I said, well, I'd like 3 tons of computer components and a month and some help. So I got that, and I ended up making this big installation, which was basically the innards of computers. I was going to put lights in them, but I didn't. And I was looking at, so I was just kind of experimenting with them. And pulling them apart and building them up in different ways. And they started to resemble views from aeroplane windows and maps of cities. And, I realized that this was the local architecture that I was surrounded by. So again, without consciously sort of trying to do something, working through a material, and that's its history and its inherent content, the content of the work, the concept of the work was coming through in this kind of other way of working, this sort of osmosis or whatever you want to call it. And also I was looking at computer motherboards and realizing that they're simply maps. They're maps for information, electricity to travel along, and they look like city maps. They look like urbanism. They look like particularly the places I was living in, and views from aeroplane windows. This is actually Chicago, because that work then took me to America, to Houston, Texas, where I was invited to do an exhibition using computer components again in the Art League of Houston. But this time I got 13 tons, which was actually a little bit much, and slightly overwhelming, because it took us about a week to just sort through them. But the great thing about that, and this was supplied by a local recycling company, because there are, talk about waste, computer components. There are just gazillions thrown away every day. And I've worked with components that are only a year or 2 old and have been thrown away. And this is like, a massive issue and problem. And they have very toxic materials in them. And they're these things that we invest all ourselves in a way. They're very private. They have all our private information. They have all our intimate details. But they're also very public and very international. So they're a really interesting material at this point in time. But, we don't really know what they look like inside, which I'm kind of curious about. They have so much color and form and texture in them, and material, different kinds of materials from all over the world that are collected and put together. And so I decided, this was the first time that I made a map. So I made similar kind of stacks and played with the material. And it was a bit like a laboratory for a month, this space. And I had students helping me, and some local artists came and helped. And I decided to make a map of America. And what was good about having 13 tons of components was that I had a real variety. So I had gold and red and actually real gold. There's a lot of real gold in these components. The gold ones are worth a lot of money, which is why they're harder to source. So I was able to play with it. And so I made a map of America that had like the bread belt and the deserts and you know, different colours, different states. Even I was playing with the political states, the blue and the red, and just kind of playing. It was actually quite a lot of fun, this show, hard work. And then I made this piece on the right, which is called Flood, which was power supplies that were all piled up. And so it was quite a kind of phenomenal big show, and very much exploring that material. And the map, the turning it into a map seemed to be like quite a turning point for me. And this actually got to stay in Houston with the guy who supplied the components had looked after it for me in his office because it was going to go to a museum in Birmingham, Alabama. But then he decided he owned it because he owned the components. So we had a big legal battle over copyright issues, which is a whole other story which you might want to ask me about. I won in the end because my neighbour was a lawyer who worked for a big international law company and managed to represent me pro bono. So it was really I was very lucky to have my neighbour. But it's a really interesting process. It took about 4 years. I didn't make much money out of it at all, but he acknowledged that it was my piece, my copyright, but he then, if he paid this money, would own the object. So it was quite an interesting, a real steep learning curve for me. So it now lives in Houston, Texas, in the office of a slightly angry recycler. And then this was what the show, in America, the show was called Vulnerable Ecologies. And I got invited by York Museums Trust to make a piece in their contemporary art showing space, which is an 11th century church in York. Amazing space. So I made a 8-meter high altarpiece out of power supplies, which was a kind of development of Flood that you saw in Houston, Texas. So, and what was great is that these components were all very new and disused, you know, put out of use. And the church was a deconsecrated church. So it was kind of nice to put these completely contemporary, these really ancient material places together. And it created this interesting juxtaposition, which I really like, of ancient and completely contemporary. And the components, the power supplies, started to look like archaeological finds. And people started to look at the stones on the floor, some of which are Roman. Also Flood, you know, it's a kind of comment on flood of information, but also York floods a lot, global warming and so on. So it all kind of fitted quite nicely together. And they used to have installations there that lasted for about a year. And then the maps, people really like the maps, so I managed to get quite a few commissions. This is in Bedfordshire University, in their entrance to their new building. So it's a map of the world. And it was very much made for that university. It's a very international university. They have a lot of computer software courses, so it sort of fitted the brief. And what was really interesting is all the software students came down to look at it, and they were really agitated because they said, we can't put that next to that. I mean, that doesn't do that. You know, they were seeing it very much from their perspective. So it was quite interesting putting a piece of work in a completely different context and getting responses from people. Then this is more recent. This is for a big company in America, in New York, and it's a map of America. It's 3 meters wide. And it was made, you know, having had some experience of making those pieces, I was actually able to quite enjoy this one because we played with it. So you've got the Rocky Mountains and you've got Chicago, which is a kind of fan, which is called Windy City, and the grid systems of LA, and the deserts and the rainforests were burning at the time. So I was put in the red where the rainforests were. The forests in California were burning at the time. So, you know, it became you know, a piece of the moment. It was made in 2019, I think. I'll just quickly go through this because I'm running out of time, but this is a completely different kind of project where I work with social practice projects, where I work with groups of people. Oftentimes when I make big installations or shows, there'll be a kind of, there'll be an element where people help or people take part in some way. This particular project was with the National Army Museum, and it was called Soldiers and Sewing, Peacemakers, Soldiers and Sewing. So I researched the collection, the Army Museum collection, as you can see. And then I was looking at the history of soldiers and sewing, which is quite big. Soldiers have sewn a lot because when you're a soldier in a battlefield, you can't really take your clothes, you know, you can't go to H&M and buy new clothes if they rip. Or you can't take them to the tailors, you have to mend them yourself, or you have to mend your kit or whatever it is. You need to be able to sew. It's a very important skill. And soldiers, this is a soldier in the Crimea who was sewing old uniforms to make quilts to keep them warm, because certainly in those days, soldiers waited a long time for battles to happen. They might be in the Crimea for years waiting for battles. So there's this sort of interesting history, because we don't really see, I think a lot of people don't really see soldiers as sewing, you know, and this is a quilt made by a soldier. And then I worked with these guys who had been in, they'd either been in Afghanistan or in Iraq or Ireland, some conflict area. And they were they were either in a rehabilitation center or they were living in accommodation provided by a charity for soldiers who had been homeless, ex-military who had been homeless and were homed as a way of trying to get them off the streets or to help them. So I worked with two different groups. This guy had been in Afghanistan, so they were the people that I worked with here at this place called, I can't remember what it's called now, it's gone, a rehabilitation centre in Wiltshire. They had lost, so it was about working, they'd been in hospital, and I was kind of classes with them where we were looking at art, working with art, and they were trying to decide what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives, basically. And then this guy, he'd been in all over the world, but in various conflicts, and he made a quilt out of all the beer mats he'd found when he travelled the world. And you know, I drew with him, he did lots of things. And then the whole process it lasted for about 2 years, and it got put together into a touring show, which was at the National Army Museum to begin with. It was consisted of photographs of them working and some of their work and text, and also a piece that I made, a quilt, which was in response to that. It was the soldiers' voices, but I actually stitched it all together. And it was partly their idea. So we found old reused army blankets and made it into a kind of chessboard quilt with text, with quotes on. And the back of it was kind of I'm a bit of a, you know, I'd probably be not fight. Be a conscientious objector, so that was peace. And then we had all these texts we chose and put on, and the middle piece was a swatch printed by one of the soldiers. He then went on to do a BA and an MA at Wimbledon, so he obviously got something out of that project. And this is me in my studio about a few years ago sewing a quilt for the V&A for a show called Quilts from 1700 to the Present Day, British Quilts. And I made it out of money that I'd collected when I'd been in China, so it's all Chinese renminbi. Some of it's still used. The map of the world in the middle, that's me sewing it. The map of the world in the middle is old money, which isn't really worth anything. And it's all stitched. The main body, the sea of Maos, the sea of 10 yuan, are stitched on a machine, and the middle bit is all hand-stitched, and there's a kind of blanket stitch around the edge. And it went into this show at the V&A, and now it's acquisitioned into their collection. So that started me off on a whole sort of trajectory of working with money, which again I think is a really fascinating material to work with, because again we take it for granted, we don't really think about it, where it comes from, where it goes. It's all changing now, but you know, it's a very international material, it lasts a long time, it's actually incredibly strong. So I started to work with money, and I started to make these little boats, and then I got invited by Tate Collective particularly, to do a project called Hyperlink, which was a sort of long weekend project where lots of different artists and makers and musicians got together and made or did things in different parts of Tate Modern. And they asked me if I would make something for the turbine hall, which was really exciting. I thought, wow, yeah, okay, yeah, of course. And then I went away and thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? I mean, it's a huge, huge space, you know, and I only had 3 months or something to make the piece. But I had these boats, and I suddenly thought, well, it's like a sea of concrete, the turbine hall. It's massive. I'm not going to compete with it scale-wise. So if I just put these very fragile, small objects in, that could work. So I tried it out, and it did work, and I made about 350 of them out of money, travel tickets, and maps. Also, it runs parallel with the Tate, you know, so there is actually a small river that runs under the turbine hall, which is a tributary of the Thames. So it was this kind of my own, this little, it's called Sail Away, and it was this little kind of flotilla of boats that ran parallel with the Thames. And then people were invited to come and interact with it, but also to come and make their own boats and add them. So we had 5 boat making stations, And lots of people came and made boats and added them. And so by the end of it, there were about 800 boats, and 800 people came and made boats and added them. So although it was initially an installation that just sat in the turbine hall with these kind of little fragile boats floating along, it then became this massive installation that 800 people took part in, and was really filled the turbine hall, and able to walk amongst them and, you know, photograph them and lie amongst them and do whatever they wanted. It was actually really successful. It was a bit of an experiment because I didn't know how that would work, and only a few got trashed. A couple got stolen, and a couple got trashed by 3-year-olds. I don't know who stole them, but the trash ones were by 3-year-olds. So it was a successful project and quite a lot of fun as well. And then people used stamps and all sorts of things. And that then went to, that kind of idea then became, I got invited to do lots of things with that idea, with that piece, and it changed and morphed. And this was in a church in Cambridge, St Peter's Church, which was part of a conference at Cambridge University called Migrant Knowledge, all about migration and what mass migration means, and how global warming and mass migration are completely interlinked, and what that means for the future. Rowan Williams was one of the leaders of it, a brilliant mind, and all these sort of great brains. I was just the artist making the piece for the conference that then continued to be in the church for about a month. But it was really interesting, that conference, because it was just before the pandemic. It was the end of summer 2019, and they predicted what was going to happen. You know, they sort of said, we're going to have some big event, because we've headed that way. This has been coming for years. It's going to happen quite soon. So what are we going to do? How are we going to manage this? And how are we going to manage ourselves? So it was an honour to be in it, and it was great to put this work in a church. It's a Norman church, so it was quite interesting, as Brexit was just about to happen, that it had been a French church. So, and it was great to have this work on, and here I put it on money, so it's on £2,000 of copper coins. I'd like to make it with £20,000 worth of gold coins, if I can get a bank to sponsor me. It's a bit more complicated. But I think everybody goes mad about the money. They get like, oh my God, look at all that money. You know, they get really obsessed with the money, especially when it's a mass of coins like that. And then they add money. And getting it from the bank. And they said, yeah, we'll save £1,000 worth of coins for you. But if any go missing, you'll have to replace them. So I said, yeah, fine, because they don't go missing, they get added to. We're about £10 in credit by the end of it. So I quite like that idea. It's a bit like in China, the recycled big cardboard stack that I made, I bought it from the local recycling company. And I then had to, I left before the end of the show, and the art centre sold it back to the local recycling company for a profit. They actually made a profit out of it. I think they made about £50 profit, so they were really happy. So it's kind of nice, the idea that I just borrow these things to make art with, like toilet paper. Your toilet paper could have been art once. I kind of borrow these products, make things with them, and then they go back into the recycling system. And that's really one of the ideas behind the work. This is up the road at Docklands Museum. There's an exhibition on at the moment called London Port City, which is all about the history of London as a port city and the Port of London. Fascinating. And I've got a piece of work, one of these little trade winds. I made a mini version in a cabinet, and it's got boats in it that all relate to, you see, there's a map of the Isle of Dogs and the docks, and different boats made of money, and maps from various countries that relate to that museum's history. I was also invited to make that at the Royal Shakespeare Company. I was artist in residence there for a year. That was another fascinating, that was like the best artist in residence I've ever done. I got to dress the actors and meet all these people and see how the theatre worked. And I also made this big sail installation. That was a trial done here, actually, in the other light well. And then we hung this huge sail installation in the atrium spaces of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-on-Avon. Okay, great. So anyway, more recent piece, I'll just skip through this. This was called Rumpelstiltskin, which is based on a fairy tale that always fascinated me, and there's about 20 sewing machines. And that one works, but I'm not quite sure how to do it, so we might come back to that. And I did It filled this space, and I did installations where I was sewing in it as well. And the sewing machines all went off on sensors and timers at different times, and we made a film of it as well. So it was a kind of activated, and then also we worked with various different groups of people from drug rehab centres and in the theatre, and made workshops where we mended people's clothes for them. So it was about this cloth, but it was also about mending clothes and working with people who might have trouble otherwise getting or mending their clothes. That was the kind of idea behind it. And I was also artist in resident at Pinson Masons Law Company in the City of London, which was interesting. I'll just zap through that quickly. I showed these dresses, these money and mat dresses that I've made over the years, and then each part of the residency was that every month I would write a newsletter about what else was going on, what I was doing, what was happening in the company. And this was about an artwork that I was making, which started before the pandemic, actually. It was called We Are All in This Together, but I changed the title since then, called We Are Not All in This Together. And so it was in the Times about the residency and what we were doing, because we were making a kind of collaborative quilt. And this is a piece called Territory Dress, which was one of my mat dresses that's in the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, in their permanent collection. And it's also on show with a film I made called Territory Dress, which is not of just, it's of the piece, but it also includes lots of archival film of ships and shipping. So we can have a look at that if you want. And this is a piece that the museum wrote about the work. And this is just a recent piece in a German magazine that featured my work through the magazine, and then did an article at the end about the process, my process really, and the material. But how that relates, that particular edition was in all about the market and how the market has to change because of climate change, and because we can't keep driving a market as we do. So the article sort of is about my work really, but the whole thing relates to the publication, that particular publication of the magazine. If you can read German, you can read it, but it's in German. So so that's and that's one of my pieces there, made of globes all lit, that were in a shopping trolley in a show in Warrington. So that's it, folks.
Thank you, Sue.
It's
Does
a little
anybody
bit
have any questions?
I mean, it's a bit rushed because, obviously I wanted to show you lots of work, but if you're interested in finding out more about any of the work, I've got a website, which is just susanstockwell.co.uk or .com, and also there's lots of articles and things online, so you can find out more about any areas that you're specifically interested. Also, the films are on the website. This is a film called Rumpelstiltskin, a film called Territory Dress.
Great stuff. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, I've got two questions. So I'm quite interested in your art when you were a student, and has that kind of carried on, like your interest formulated when you're a student and you brought that into your career, or is it kind of something that's
You
evolved?
mean when I was a student, what I was interested in? Very
Yes.
much. I mean, for me, that formative project, that first project I did at Sheffield, was very formative because it forced me to think about materials and what materials really are, and material culture and history of materials, and how I can work physically, sculpturally, with a material and push it. That the material is not just a ground to draw on, it's not just an object to screw together, it's actually something much more. So that set, I think, a methodology of working that I've used ever since in one way or another. As you can kind of see it through the paper and the rubber and the computer components particularly. And also, when I was at Sheffield, I also used found materials a lot. So I collected things off the street or from skips and made things from them. I haven't shown you any pictures of those, but that's another thing that comes into the work. So it was for me, it was a very formative course. But, it doesn't necessarily, we all find those moments at different points, I think. It just happened, it was kind of neat that it happened in Sheffield for me. But I think you find those at different times of your development, and whether you're at college, pre-college, after college, whatever. I think everybody's different.
Okay, thank you. And also, what kind of advice would you give to an emerging artist who hasn't really got their foot in the industry yet, but is really interested in going out and doing residencies?
Oh, right, okay. Well, it depends what you want to do. I think you have to really, be true. It sounds a bit cliche, but be true to yourself. Do what you want to do. Stick with what you want to do. Get, whatever it is, it's sort of a gut thing, I think, often. It tells you, you tell you what it is you want. So if you want to do, if you want to be an artist, it depends whether you want a commercial artist or a fine artist. They're often sort of different things, I think. But, I mean, for me, it was never money-driven. Strangely, I work with money. It was never money-driven. I was always much more interested in the subject, in the history, in the materiality, in the making. I mean, I've realised as years gone by, I should have been a little bit more interested in the commercial side of it and in making money from it. But it's meant that I've had an interesting life and I've travelled the world, But I think you have to think about what you want. And then if you want to do residencies, I mean, there are gazillions of residencies. All I would say, and they can be for free. There might just be somebody who wants you to help out with a workshop. It might be, I mean, I would say, to begin with, do something that you're really interested in, but you need to, don't just be somebody used by a institution or a whatever, a company to kind of promote their goods or to help them out. You're not a free hired hand, you're not free labor. You've got to get something out of it. What do you want from it? Do you want to be paid? Do you want to have an exhibition? Do you want to do workshops or do some collaborative practice? Do you want to get publicity? Do you want to travel? Do you want it to be in another country? I mean, I wouldn't do one without being paid. And I just make sure that it was what they said it was, because sometimes you get there and they're not actually what they say they are. So you need to know you've got a space if you want that. It's very much about what you want. But I think you want to get experience as well when you first leave college, and doing residencies is quite a good way to get experience and to meet people, to make contacts and connections. Okay, does that answer your question? Okay.
I have a question actually, and it's about the dress you made. I wanted to ask if you ever thought about making it wear to someone.
Sorry.
I was thinking, did you ever think about making it wear to someone, like?
Oh, a dress to wear?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have thought about that. They're very much what I call sculptural dresses. They're not dresses to wear. And that's always been important for me because they are objects. They're these empty forms. They're waiting for the story to fill them. So, I think they're very much about the stories that haven't been told. They've got this kind of ghostly presence. And the stories that haven't been told by women through history, by anyone who's oppressed through history. That's what the maps are about. The money dress is very much about, again, people don't have power in our culture unless they have economic power. So they're kind of, for me, the emptiness of them is important because it says something that's intrinsic to the work, to the meaning of the work. However, I have thought about making them to wear because when I was at school, I used to sew. My mum sewed all our clothes, being part of a make-do-and-mend household, and my granny. So she made all our clothes until the late 70s, and I grew up learning how to make. And when I was at school, I won a prize for the best made dress in the school. So I can make those things, I can just make them. I don't have to have a pattern or anything. And then I did sculpture, so I did a bit of anatomy, and so I know how the body works. I know how to put them together. So I have thought about making them because it would be a good way of making money, and I have some ideas that would kind of, I think, work as objects, as worn objects that could still work as artworks as well.
Actually, what I was thinking about, what if, I don't know, she made it wear to someone and that person was just walking around the exhibition,
Yeah.
That could be an idea.
I mean, you have to kind of also, I'm not a Grace and Perry or, there's lots of, but there's other ways of doing. I don't want to go into a territory that isn't really me, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, it's worth thinking. I do think about it. I just haven't acted on it.
Yeah, I just was Detour Ahead.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, Susan. Um, you having to travel all over the world and having all of this experience with seeing and exploring in many in many areas, especially the one with so making art like at the end, and you continually do. My question is, how did this affect you? You like witnessing the globalization, inequalities, migrants, sufferings, and all of this. How did it impact in your work? And how do you see younger artists making a change?
Can you sort of repeat the question? Because I can't quite hear it.
Yeah, not a problem. All these events through materials in your work and working different ways of making art, like money and making boats.
Mm-hmm.
You must have lots of inequalities. How do you see the globalization today? The inequalities between and migrants matters, and how do you see our new artists evolving and making change through their art?
I think I see what you mean. The boats, by the way, were, you know, a nice kind of joining. I was working with money, and then I thought, oh, a note makes a perfect boat, and then we hold all our ideas in money and boat and travel, you know, so it kind of made a sort of good connection. I think it's a really difficult question, that, because I think as an artist, you know, I am interested in politics, and I am interested in the work having a concept. You know, as you can see, it's evolved, that whole concept has evolved over a long period of time. But I don't see, it's very hard to kind of say, well, I'm an artist and I do this, and then therefore I help people, because it doesn't work like that, you know. And I just think all I can do as an artist is make what I make. And I do believe in some way, I might be misguided, but I do believe that art does actually communicate in ways that aren't spoken. And it's very unique and it's very different, and it has this very kind of rich way of communicating that's quite difficult to articulate, but it communicates on other levels. And there are words for it, aren't there? There are particular ways of describing that. So I wouldn't claim that I'm doing anything for anybody. I'm just making what I want to make. I don't claim that as an artist I have any, you know, I mean, I seem to get work and I seem to be invited to do projects with people. Might just be that I like people, and I grew up in an educational household as well, so I know sort of how to work with people to a degree. Some people might disagree with that. But so I don't know, actually, is the answer. I wouldn't claim that I'm an artist who's really doing anything. I just hope that in some way it does. I don't know. But I don't know. That's for other people to tell me. I think a lot of the questions, I don't answer questions. I just hopefully ask them, that's all. I don't really have the answers. I'm just hoping that all I can do is just highlight a few little things, or ask a few questions, put a few flags up. You know, that's the most I would ever hope that I could do in that context.
You didn't answer my question, as you said, art communicates in a way which how others perceive it, and that's the answer which I wanted.
Yeah, I mean, art's powerful. It has been through history, hasn't it, if you look back? And governments are very wary of artists, so that proves that art is powerful. It must work if governments like to contain it and, you know, put it down. It means, yes, it's obviously really powerful.
Thank you very much, Sue. Can we have a round of applause, please?
Thank you.
So, of course, you're welcome to ask Sue any questions at the end of the session. Is that okay, Sue?
Yeah, I'll be around for a bit. Yeah, so if you have questions or whatever, please feel free.